the number of long works being written have dropped off, especially compared to the number of short works that people are writing. And part of that is sort of a paradigm shift in the community. You know, in '95, when the competition was getting started, everyone was still very much living in the shadow of Infocom. And so the idea was you were going to make an Infocom-sized game. You know, I spent a year plus of my life writing a big game. And that's what people were doing. And then all of a sudden, John's Fire Witch came out, which was the guy who wrote it called it a little snack-sized game because, you know, you could do it in a couple of hours. People were like, well, that's kind of interesting. For some reason, I hadn't thought you could do that. Again, everyone was trying to echo what Infocom was doing. So one of the downsides to the competition is it's really shifted attention to much shorter works. And there are fewer longer works coming out now than there were in the mid-90s when the community was first really becoming a vibrant community. Part of that, as you say, is attention span. Part of that is it takes a long time to write something like that. And so especially if you're trying something a little more experimental that you don't know how people will react to it, it's easier to write a shorter game so that you can get it out there faster, you can get feedback faster. And if it turns out to crash and burn, you can go, well, that was 3 or 4 months of my life instead of, that was my 2-year masterpiece.
Now, what brought you into running the IF Comp?
I was drafted. Kevin Wilson created the competition and ran it for a couple of years. And then a friend of mine, David Dyke, who wrote A Bear's Night Out, Kevin asked him to take over. And after that first year, I think because of a number of things going on, David was like, yeah, this is not really something I want to do that much. And so he turned to me and said, you know, I think you do a pretty decent job of running it. Are you willing to take it? And so I thought about it for a little while. I was like, yeah, sure. You know, I'll do this for a couple of years and then I can hand it off. And so he sort of told me what he and Kevin before him had worked out as the process of dealing with the games and putting them all up and doing all of that. And then he was like, okay, good luck. And immediately thereafter sent me an email saying, okay, so here's how I think you should need to change the competition. Because the early years were marked with people always emailing in and saying, or posting and saying, oh, this competition sucks, so you need to change this and this and this and this and this. So he figured the first thing I should receive as the new interactive fiction competition head cheese was an email from him telling me, you should change all these things. So that's how I ended up getting drafted to run the competition and discovered that I really enjoy running it. And still enjoy running it, and so have stayed at its helm. It started out like the first year, '95. What we did is we all wrote our games, and then we all individually FTP'd them up to the FTP archive, and then people could download and emailed in their votes. By the time that I had taken over, Kevin and then David had gotten to the point where everybody emailed the games to them, and they ran them and made sure that they worked, and ran the walkthroughs, and did all of that, and then uploaded them to the archive. And what I ended up doing was sort of shaving some of that effort off at the beginning. Like I don't run all of the games all the way through. I don't play them through to make sure that they are playable or winnable. At this point, there are too many and my time is too limited for that. But what I have done and tried to do is make it easier for people to get to the games in various and sundry ways. And make it easier, if you're going to be a judge, to judge them. Some examples of that are, for a long time, the community has used an interface to finding the games that is written as a text adventure, which is really cool and I like a lot, and to an outsider is completely incomprehensible. To someone who is not steeped in interactive fiction already, you know, they're going to pick up this game that tells them how to get to the games and which games to play and how to vote and go, what the heck? So one of the things that we've done is move to having a web-based interface. You know, we've moved to offering the games through BitTorrent because the Interactive Fiction Archive is notoriously bandwidth limited because, you know, it's run essentially on a shoestring. We're not paying a lot of money for all of this. So by moving to BitTorrent, I can have people grab them and use each other's bandwidth and get the games much faster than that single choke point of the archive. So I feel like a lot of my work has been in trying to make it easier to get to the competition games and easier to vote, because otherwise, you know, why bother? It shouldn't be hard to get to these things. We typically have about 250 people a year register votes. Now, I know that there are a lot more people downloading than that and playing at least some of the games. The statistics are hard to come by because I can look at the BitTorrent statistics and then the main archives statistics, but we've got a bunch of different mirrors that hold them. So, at some point I'm like, how many people are really downloading them? My best guess is you've got 1,000 to 2,000 people who will download it and try at least one or two games. And then out of that, about 250 people who play enough, play it within the time frame, and then enter their boats. I'd say most of the authors spend about 2 to 3 months. A lot of them in March will see the announcement where I say, hey, anyone want to enter? They'll go, that's a pretty good idea. And so around about May, especially if they're students and are getting out of school, they'll go and they'll start noodling on the game and they'll work on it and polish it and then get it ready for the October deadline and get it uploaded. Now, there are some people who work at it longer, 6 months. I've known a couple of cases where someone has written me and said, now, I haven't released it before, but I've been working on this game for 4 years. Is it okay if I enter it? And I'm like, okay, good luck. I hope it was worth your 4 years. There's continuously new stuff coming out. And by new stuff, I mean not just new games, but new ideas and new directions in the art form. One of the most exciting things to me is that, in the interactive fiction competition, you'll have 30 or 40 games, and a lot of them will be Drek. A lot of them will be rehashes. Some of them will be really well-crafted games that do traditional things really well. And then on occasion, you'll have 1, 2, 3 games that do something completely mind-blowing. And it may end up being stupid, but it may end up being great. And so it's really exciting to me to get to see people taking their creative energies and putting them into this art form in ways that I would never have imagined. And seeing what they come up with is just fabulous. And that's really what keeps me going. Somebody, in fact, this year asked me, you're coming up on 10 years of doing the competition. Have you thought about stepping down? And I have, but what I've decided is as long as I'm still excited and as long as I'm still interested in really making sure that the competition happens and really interested in trying to help authors get their games in the competition, then I think I'm still interested in running the competition. If the day comes that an author emails me and says, I really want to enter the competition, I'm like, yeah, so what? That's probably the time when I need to say, enough, I'm done. But I'm not at that point. One day in early '97, a bunch of people in the community got this email from a company called The Mining Company, and they were saying they were trying to create a new web directory. Now these, of course, being the days before Google and good searching and things like that. And what they were trying to do is sort of recreate the idea of a librarian in the digital age. What they were doing is going around to people who had knowledge of different subjects and saying, come, what we want you to do is maintain an annotated list of links for us and write essays and articles about this topic. And so a bunch of us got these emails, and there was discussion on the news group saying, are these people legit? Is this a real thing? Is this a scam? And I decided I was interested enough in it because I was a grad student and had more time than money. And they were promising some money that I would try writing for them. And they accepted me, and I became a guide at the mining company, which later became About.com, which later became About a Primedia company, and has since passed through a bunch of different hands. But there for a number of years, for about 3 or 4 years, they were paying me to write about interactive fiction and to maintain this list of links. And I was like, well, I'm already in the community. I'm already interested in writing stuff. Why not get paid to do it? And so there were months where they were paying me more than my graduate student stipend, which granted is not saying much, but at the time was heady amounts of cash. So it was very odd to be in a situation where I was sort of reporting on the community and trying to represent it to, an average guy surfing the net who'd come along to my site and start browsing around in it. But overall, it was a really positive experience, and best of all, when they started the company, they didn't think that the articles that we would be writing would be worth anything. So they gave us full copyright on them. So when they ended up downsizing, as all .coms did, and getting rid of a bunch of us, I could take all of those writings with me and go, ha, 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 these are all mine, you can't have them. A minor oversight on their part, I'm sure. One of the most interesting things about that job is I would get emails from people just across the spectrum, some of whom would find my site and go, wow, I didn't know people were still writing text adventures. And I think this is sort of part of what got me interested in evangelizing to a certain extent, and part of why I think David thought about me for running the interactive fiction competition because I was already evangelizing and already doing these kinds of things. But I had this one just heartbreaking case of a woman who wrote me and said, you know, I have lupus, and there are very few things that I can do because of my condition. I can't really go outside all that often. I can't do any sports or exercise or things like that. You know, it's really crippling. I can't play newer computer games, even though I'm holed up inside because it takes too fast reaction times and you know, my condition keeps me from doing that. But I can play adventure games, and I've been playing adventure games for all of these years, and I'm really excited that you're writing about these adventure games. And I'm moving into a new apartment where I can't keep all of these games that I have been, you know, that I bought and I played. I want to send these to you because I've heard you talk about the fact that you collect these games. Will you take these from me? And I was just floored that somebody, just out of the blue, someone I didn't know, had been affected enough by what I had been doing that they were like, here, please, take these from me. You can have them. And I was just astounded. Lois McMaster-Bujold has said that a genre is a group of works in conversation with itself. And I really like that quote because I think interactive fiction as a medium is sort of in conversation with itself. And the community is the group of people that have sort of grown up around that conversation and taken part in that conversation and are writing the works about it. And in the old days, it started on a group of Usenet news groups, Rec Arts Int Fiction and Rec Games Int Fiction, that were originally talking about hypertext and things like that, but slowly discussion of Infocom games came to dominate it in the early 90s. And so there was this nucleus of people who were interested in interactive fiction and talking about it and doing reverse engineering of Infocom's story format and all that kind of thing. And so there slowly grew this group of people made up of computer programmers and academicians because they were the ones early on the internet. You had some more artistic types who were interested in the medium, and the academics who later were studying it as an art form. And so all of these people sort of accumulated around this news group. These days the community is a lot more spread out because there are a lot more avenues of discussion on the internet. You know, back then Usenet was the thing going, but now you've got blogs, you've got people who have chat rooms, you've got people who have bulletin boards set up on different groups. And the other thing is there have been a bunch of different sort of islands of communities in games. You know, you had the interactive fiction community over here all sort of off in an island by itself. You had the people who were interested in, you know, first-person shooters over here, and you had all these different groups of people all spread around. But what's happened, especially with the rise of indie games and people writing independent games of all different flavors and colors, is these communities are starting to grow together. You've got people writing blog posts about new independent games in general, and they'll mention interactive fiction over here, and they'll mention a casual game over here, and they'll mention a real-time strategy game over here. And so the communities are kind of starting to grow together, which is, I think, really exciting and helps keep any of these communities from completely stagnating. So I don't know that that necessarily sums up the community, but I think hopefully that gives you some idea of the breadth of the directions that the community is reaching out in, from the traditional gamists to the people who are interested in the academic side of it as an art form, to the people who are interested in indie games in general and are coming in that direction. It's my dad's fault. It's all, you know, parents. You never can trust them. My dad is a teacher at a small liberal arts college, and they had a set of VAX. It was a VAX 11750 with the VT100 terminals. And, you know, I was, I don't know, 5, 6, 7. And that was really cool, so I wanted to come and see the computer because this strange computers that people were playing with, I wanted to have a chance to play with. So he took me there one time and sat me on his lap, and we sat in that VT100 with the glowing letters and all of that. And he booted up Adventure, Colossal Cave. And that was the first time I ever ran into an interactive fiction game, which I was young enough that I was like, after about 5 minutes, I was like, this is really boring. I want to do something else. But obviously, I didn't keep that attitude forever. At 5 and 6, you know, I was reading, but not a tremendous amount. And I didn't really have the capability of putting the logic together to figure out how the game was operating. So it was completely above my head. But I came back to it later, especially after we had a computer in the house. We got a nice Trash 80 Model 4 because we always like to be on the losing side. We didn't have a Betamax, but close. And so if you ever looked at a TRS-80, there just was not a lot of games in there other than text adventures. So we got some Scott Adams, we got some of the homebrew ones that were floating around the academic community. And then I ended up with an Infocom game. And I had already gotten interested in playing them with the Scott Adams ones, and playing an Infocom one was dramatically different and really changed my opinion of how those things, they were sort of things to waste my time, fun little diversions, and then I hit Infocoms. I was like, wow, this is really, really good. Infidel was the first one that I played, and I just remember I was used to sort of the two-word parsers and the very limited room descriptions and things like that, and the homebrew ones that were published in Byte and things like that were not really that much of a step up. And then all of a sudden, a year or two later, I get this copy of Infidel and I start playing it, and here are these big descriptions, and there's this whole story leading through, and there's this logicalness to it that really appealed to me. What happened was I ended up with Frank DaCosta's book on writing text adventures. So I started writing my own. I wrote, ones to entertain myself. I wrote ones. I wrote an educational one, which is dreadful and will hopefully never, ever, ever see the light of day again. One of my friends who was on bulletin boards found a copy of Agate and put that in my hand. So I started playing with that, and I was like, oh, this is crap. This needs to be extended. There's a lot more you could do with it. So I started sketching out how you would make the next generation of it. And then that same friend said, hey, maybe you want to take a look at TADS. At which point I took all of my notes and wadded them up and threw them in the fireplace. So I was writing these with TADS, and when my university fully got on the internet in 1991, 1992, I started poking around seeing what there was to do, and came across the news groups, came across Usenet, and so stumbled onto the interactive fiction news groups. I forget even how I found it, because I certainly wasn't looking for int fiction or something like that. But I found it and started hanging out and said, oh, these people like the same kind of things I do. These people like text adventures. I'm going to hang around. And the nice thing was that was the transition era where people were still trying to reverse engineer the Z machine and figure out how Z code worked and put all of that together. And so it was interesting to watch all of these people putting their heads together and figure that out, while I sat over here with my copy of TADS feeling really smug because it was great, and writing my own text adventures. And then one day out came Curses and Inform, and I said, wow, somebody took all those notes on the Z machine and turned it into a very idiosyncratic compiler, and it's really cool.
Did you try writing in Inform and stuff?
Well, I had already sort of made that conceptual leap with TADS. The big things about going from Agate to TADS was TADS had a full-featured programming language in it. It was not sort of a fill-in-the-database fields approach. And more importantly, it had that abstracted library layer, so that there were already chair objects and rooms and exits and things like that that you could pull in wholesale into your game. And that was really the point where the light bulb went on in my head. I said, aha, that's how you do one of these things. What you do is you have this abstraction layer that describes the game world for you. It's not necessarily hard-coded in, but it's already there and you pull it in as you need it. Starting out, I was very much trying to imitate the adventure games that I had enjoyed. So I wrote this weird... My early games were sort of weird crosses between Infocom games and the Sierra graphic adventure games that I also enjoyed. So, lots of sudden death rooms and all kinds of things that if you look at it from a game design standpoint, like, yeah, I really probably shouldn't have done that. And as I went on, it started out as just sort of entertainment, and then as I went on, it became something that was more... I started thinking more about, well, what can I do with this? There's early examples, for example, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where there's the room that it won't let you go into until you've done it a couple of times. And then when you look, it says, oh, no, there's nothing here. And you look again, it says, no, really, there's nothing here. And you look again, they're like, okay, fine, there is something here. And those early ideas, combined with some of the stuff that started coming out in the mid-1990s, Andrew Plotkin's work, Adam Kadri's work, made me start thinking, this is interesting. There are things that you can do with this medium that are very different than what you can do in other mediums, and sort of that ping-ponging back and forth between the player, the player's avatar, the computer program as intermediator, and me as the author doing the computer program. And that slowly started filtering into the kind of works that I was doing. A lot of people are not thinking about who's going to play my game. Why are they going to want to play the game, and what makes it fun? And I completely understand this. Typically I say that I'm the poster child for getting better through practice, because my early games were terrible. The first games that you can still find on the IF archive are kind of so-so, and then I sort of start hitting my stride into, let me at least say, competence. And that was when I started thinking, why will someone want to type the next command? And I've seen Adam Kadri and Dan Shayovitz make a lot about this, because it's the crucial step to realize, why should somebody, especially given all the kinds of things that they could be doing right now, why should they keep playing my game? And the competition sort of gives people an out, because people are going to play all of the competition games, regardless of whether they're good, regardless of whether they're crappy. And so I think part of the reason people tend to enter the competition is they're guaranteed that audience, which is good, because it does tend to focus attention. But it's also bad, because I think in some cases people say, well, yeah, it's kind of crappy. Yeah, I didn't finish it or get it beta tested, but let me enter it anyway and see what people think. And sometimes that's inexperience. If you've not thought about what it takes to get an adventure together and get it polished and get it to where someone will actually want to play it, you don't necessarily think about, maybe doing beta testing, which is why I send out emails at the beginning of the competition and say, welcome, glad you're going to be writing. Here's the schedule, and oh, by the way, beta test, beta test, beta test. Get somebody besides you and maybe your mom to play this game and make sure that it's playable, it's winnable, and it's fun. The audience for the interactive fiction competition, in a number of cases, has been, like me, been sitting through these since 1995. And so after a while, maybe you had patience for somebody starting you out asleep in your bedroom, like tons and tons of other games. And then after a while, you're like, okay, people, pay attention. There are so many examples of this. Play a couple of games and you'll figure out this is not what you want to be doing. And so people get really impatient with that, and they tend to be a little more sarcastic about it. I've seen some people whose approach to grading the games and reviewing them, sort of like they take points away from the games, like ripping wings off of flies. You start out at a 10, and then you've got a spelling error, so now you're at 9, and this command doesn't work, so you're at an 8, just ripping them off one by one. Thankfully, not everybody is like that. I think the canonical example of that was Photopia in 1998, which was, I happened to be up against it with another game. And I had been, of course, I'm nervous about all the other people, how good is my game? How's it going to be received? So I'm playing through them. And it's like, oh, that's crap, that's crap. That's pretty good. I don't know, that's about on my level. And then I hit Photopia, and it's like, this is something completely different. This is so far and away beyond what we're doing over here that it was very obviously, at least in my mind, going to place, if not very high. I was expecting it to place first, but at least place very high. So I think that's a case where it was far and away beyond what the other games in the competition were doing. A lot of us were coming from, we played Infocom games when we were young, and we want to make new versions of them. I'm a programmer, and this is a cool programming thing, so I'm going to write my own text adventure. And Adam was very much coming from the more literary side of things. He did not grow up playing Infocom games. I know he's on record as saying he picked up Masterpieces of Infocom one day in the re-release and played through them and thought that was pretty good, and then discovered the games from that first 1995 interactive fiction competition that had been bundled on there and said, people are still making these. Well, that's kind of cool. So he did not come from it as sort of an exercise in nostalgia or an exercise in trying to recapitulate what had happened before. He was coming at it as a completely new art form. And so I think that is part of why he was able to make that leap much faster than a lot of other people in the community. Because even back when I was first writing my biggest game, Losing Your Grip, in 96, 97, the protagonist was not the nameless, faceless adventurer. And in 95 and 96, we were still having these discussions about, can you have someone who is not a direct avatar for the player? Can you give them characteristics and a name, and maybe they don't like cheese or whatever? Can you give them standard kind of characterizations that you would see in static fiction and do it in interactive fiction? And some people are like, oh, no way. The player will be too distanced from it. So you've got to make sure that they're nameless and they're faceless and they don't have any of those. And it's interesting to me that we were still having those debates up into 96, 97. And so that sort of gives you maybe a sense of what the community was like when something like Photopia came around. I'm a pretty good middle-of-the-road guy, and I think that's because I grew up playing them as entertainment, and strictly as entertainment. There wasn't a view of it as specifically an art form. And certainly when I was a 12-year-old playing some of these, I wasn't thinking, well, this is an interesting new medium with striking new ideas in it. So I still enjoy playing a number of games just as games. That is, just for the sheer enjoyment of puzzle solving or exploring or things like that. But I'm also, part of the curse of being the son of an academician and having a liberal arts degree is thinking, well, it's kind of interesting that it is a different form of storytelling. And how do you deal with the fact that you've got story on the one hand and then you've perhaps got puzzles on the other, and using puzzles as pacing elements? Well, if you're not going to use puzzles, then how do you pace things? How do you make something be more interactive? All of those kinds of issues that the community, and especially the academic side of the community, is wrestling with. I guess I am enough of a big tent guy that I think there is room enough for both and need for both, because the more artistic games are not necessarily going to draw in a big new audience. You run the danger of sort of getting off into this sort of closed cul-de-sac where you're making games that comments on other games that comment on other games that comment on other games, and it becomes very incestuous. Whereas the more entertainment side of games are much more likely to pull people in and have them come in as newcomers to the genre. I definitely fall more on the evangelical side, but I understand the desire to wall things off and be more cautious about people coming in and out. I think that's just sort of natural group dynamics. We're talking about a community that has been around. We're coming up really on 20 years worth of community if you go back to the early internet days. And so that's just sort of the thing that, I've seen it develop in a lot of other different communities. I think that's just sort of natural. We like change, but not too much, and only the right kinds of change. And so that's the reaction that a lot of people have, and I'm completely sympathetic to it.
I assume you find yourself in a position of having to explain what these things are.
Occasionally I do, but I don't really have a good elevator speech for it, which is a shame. I guess that means I'm not cut out for marketing. But what I try to talk about is you're looking at a story told through text on a computer, where you are interacting with it, sort of going back and forth, typically by moving around, solving puzzles, and revealing bits of the story as you go along. So it's a chance to, in essence, have somebody tell you a story within the context of a game, and do it based in text. And that really does not boil down nicely for a fortune cookie, I admit. Typically what I end up having to do is I fumble around and talk about it for a little while, and then I say, here, sit down for a second, let me show you something, and then demonstrate it to them. I see, for instance, you see people say, I want to get somebody interested in comic books or science fiction or mysteries or something like that. What one thing should I put in their hands that's going to change their life and completely make them say, this is great, I want to do this all the time? And invariably, every person has at least 3 different answers. And that's no different within the interactive fiction community. I think there are so many pieces that have the capability of drawing somebody in that I can't pick 1 or 2. That being said, my tendency now would be to choose a more modern adventure, mainly because to modern sensibilities, a lot of the earlier games are very sparsely implemented. There's a lot of sort of fiddly guess the verb problems with them. So I would lean towards a more modern game that is more directly designed to be easy to get into and easy to play.